to put them into perpetual slavery and to take all their possessions and property.
That papal bull is kind of the birth of white Christian relationship to Native people, to indigenous people. One of the things it did was it allowed people, white people or non-Native people, non-indigenous people, to put themselves on a higher level of their relationship with God.
40 years and numerous additional edicts reinforcing these beliefs would pass before Columbus set foot in the New World.
By the time Columbus arrives in the Western Hemisphere in 1492, the thought that these people he's encountering are made in the image of God doesn't even enter into his consciousness at that point, because for 40 years now, the church and these European nations have been operating under the understanding that these are not people. It's like any other resource. You can do what you will with it. And we as natives kind of point to this as the foundation for all of the atrocities that takes place with so-called discovery and imperialism, because we were not seen as human. We were seen as barbarians. We were resources to either be enslaved and utilized or removed entirely.
The Doctrine of Discovery was both a political and religious document, sanctioning centuries of slavery, genocide, and other atrocities worldwide. Even now, its tenets remain embedded in modern society.
The very fact that I have a piece of paper that says that I own this house and the lot that it's on, my right to own that is rooted in the Doctrine of Discovery.
In the 19th century, a series of Supreme Court cases updated the Doctrine of Discovery from the age of exploration to the time of westward expansion. In the 1823 case of Johnson versus McIntosh, the court ruled unanimously that natives did not own the land that they occupied, as it belonged to the European nation that discovered it. That ruling provided the groundwork for westward colonial expansion via the land rush, the pioneer spirit, and the belief in manifest destiny. Manifest destiny being the belief that white settlers had a right, imbued by God, to claim all the lands of the continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific.
This land is mine! Mine by destiny!
The value for Native people has always been our land. That's what they wanted. They always wanted our land.
The hunger for land required policies for the removal or eradication of Native communities. These included forced relocation to reservations, forced conversion to Christianity, outlawing Native spiritual practice, and child removal to boarding schools.
Well, I guess I can start out with my own story. I was sent to a boarding school when I was a child, and it was called St. Mary's School for Indian Girls, and it was run by the church. And when we got to the school, we were isolated or separated from our families. We went to school, of course, we took our classes, but before we did that, we worked. We were the maintenance crew for the school. So we took care of the grounds, we took care of the buildings, we did all of the work. That is the Doctrine of Discovery on the church side, because they took our family away, they took our identity away. We really became non-children.
The boarding school system aspired to nothing less than the total annihilation of Native identity. As Brigadier General Richard Henry Pratt, founder of Carlisle Indian Industrial School, wrote, "Kill the Indian, save the man."
Quite literally, boarding schools are where Indians went to die.
You don't know who you are anymore because your family traditions are gone. Your cultural traditions are gone. Your pride is gone. You aren't Indian or Native American anymore, and you're not white.
The voice that screams from the shadows of these boarding schools is that these were horrible places. These were places of trauma, abuse, of death.
The goal of eradicating Native identity has allowed white people to ignore the very existence of modern Native people.
people don't bring Native Americans into their collective imagination and collective consciousness into the 20th century, and certainly not into the 21st century.
People say, well, you say you're Indian, but you don't look Indian.
What does it mean to look Indian? For many, it means a romanticized pop culture cliche.
A noble chief on horseback wearing a headdress, or an Indian maiden at the side of a babbling brook doing her daily tasks.
The failure to imagine contemporary Native people has left American culture dangerously uninformed.
Now listen up. These are our seats now, and there ain't a damn thing you can do about it. So why don't you and Super Engine there find yourself someplace else to have a powwow? Okay?
I would say it probably happens twice a year, where someone will say, I seriously thought that the Native people had all died out, that there were no Native people anymore.
The erasure of Native identity in America and in Christianity has left all of us looking at an incomplete image of the world. When we ignore cultures, erase authentic identities, we ignore part of God's creation.
What is missing when you completely other Native people and you shut them out and you don't allow the wisdoms from their ceremonial practices and their spirituality, you don't even give it audience, you don't even give it a good face-to-face. You're missing so much. You're missing rootedness. You're missing connection.
By some accounts, the Women's March in January of 2017 was the biggest single-day protest in the history of the United States. In response to the election of President Donald Trump, an estimated 4.5 million people marched in the streets across the nation. But not everyone felt welcome at the marches that day. Many women of color, in particular, felt excluded from the organizing efforts and unwelcome at the event.
The critique was of the Women's March was that it only represented a narrow portion of women.
The event's original name, the Million Women March, was the same as the historic march in 1997, organized by Black women to protest the feminist movement's history of ignoring women of color.
There was this focus on what the general understanding of women's rights and equality would be, and for some, that's what white women's interests are.
Because some considered the Women's March to be primarily an expression of white interests, it places the event in a long history of tension between the efforts for women's equality and advancing rights for people of color. A tension perhaps best illustrated in the person of Susan B. Anthony. Anthony was a Quaker, born in 1820 in Massachusetts. She spent her life tirelessly fighting for women's rights, particularly the right to vote. A founding member of the American Equal Rights Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association, Susan B. Anthony is perhaps the most well-known figure from the women's suffrage movement. She is a towering figure in the fight for women's equality in the United States. More specifically, equality for white women. Susan B. Anthony's legacy in the feminist movement stands, and should, but it should not be divorced from her legacy on race. Anthony was close friends with abolitionist Frederick Douglass and active in the anti-slavery movement. But upon the passage of the 14th Amendment, which gave voting rights to black men and not white women, she responded thus:
"We say if you will not give the whole loaf of suffrage to the entire people, give it to the most intelligent first. If intelligence, justice, and morality are to have precedence in the government, let the question of the woman be brought up first, and that of the Negro last."
Words like these established the women's equality movement in the United States as one primarily motivated by white women seeking power comparable to white men. Interests that alienated women of color from the feminist movement for over a century.
I never thought of myself as a feminist because the way it was portrayed in the world as it felt like a very white movement, burn the bra. No one's going to burn their bra. That bra costs $10.99 or whatever. So it was always this kind of, where do I belong in this movement? Am I a part of this movement at all?
Excluded from the women's movement due to racism, women of color also faced oppression from men in the civil rights movement. Consider the story of Ella Baker.
I am here to represent the struggle that has gone on for 300 or more years. A struggle to be recognized as citizens in a country in which we were born.
I would call her a leader. She probably wouldn't call herself that because she was a person who liked to be behind the scenes.
Throughout her work, Baker argued for truly shared power among a network of leaders rather than relying on charismatic individuals. This opinion was not popular with many of the prominent men in the movement.
And what she noticed among the black ministers there was their extreme sexism. And she was not afraid to call that out. And so Ella Baker had these difficult relationships, particularly with folks like Dr. King and with black ministers, because they did not want to see black women in positions of leadership and power because of the gender dynamics at the time.
Baker is remembered as a crucial organizer and voice for black women in the civil rights movement. Someone who stood up to sexism when she saw it. And she was not alone.
Ella Baker's life becomes kind of a mirror through which we can see the lives of other women. The fact that we have many black women working behind the scenes, doing all types of work for the movement, and yet we know very little about them. And Ella Baker really caused us to redefine and rethink leadership and the democratic potential of civil rights.
There is a word for the combined experience of oppression that women of color have faced in the United States. It's a word that has become very popular in recent years, but is often misunderstood.
Intersectionality.
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 The word intersectionality was coined by civil rights activist and professor Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, calling attention to the reality that an individual can experience compounding oppression from multiple directions for different aspects of their identity.
Usually we think of race, class, gender, sexuality, etc. What parts of a person's identity kind of come together to create their specific form of oppression?
Attention to intersecting identities began to emerge in the 1970s, with groups like the Combahee River Collective, which formed to address the needs of not only black feminists, but also black lesbians. One member of the Combahee River Collective, poet and activist Audre Lorde, succinctly captured the importance of intersectional feminism.
I simply do not believe that one aspect of myself can possibly profit from the oppression of any other part of my identity. Within the lesbian community, I am black. And within the black community, I am a lesbian. I cannot afford the luxury of fighting one form of oppression only.
The influence of women like Ella Baker, the Combahee River Collective, and Kimberly Crenshaw is evident in the more recent creation of a powerful contemporary political movement, Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter was created by Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors after George Zimmerman was acquitted for the murder of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. In the past 10 years, Black Lives Matter has grown into an international organization comprised of dozens of chapters, fighting on behalf of racial profiling, police abuse, transgender rights, and many other injustices.
I really like the organizational structure of Black Lives Matter in the sense that it's decentralized, that the way they think about leadership is different. Instead of having one particular charismatic leader, they don't have that. What they call their movement a leader-full movement. I think the fact that, not only is it 3 women, but 3 queer women starting Black Lives Matter, I think that's really important for thinking about the ways in which we can be more intersectional in our approach to justice.